change, and yesterday there was some snow. But thank you for having me, and thank you for taking the time to share with us today.
My pleasure, Jeff. Thanks for being here.
And you recently just did what to me is one of the most legendary sort of outdoor excursions, and it's become a bit commercialized in recent years, but it's an internationally known walk called the Overland Track. And you just did this a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah, I did it with some friends and with my kids who are teenagers now, and it was fantastic. Highly recommend it. Beautiful to get out in the wilderness and have a well-organised walk with back to basics to an extent, but there's cabins that that you stay in each night, and they're basic. They're just you have to bring your own bedding and your own mattress and food and everything.
I've stayed at the one at Pelion before.
Oh yeah, that's a nice one.
Yes. So did you start at the Cradle Mountain Inn and end up at Lake St. Clair?
Yes. Yep.
And how many days did you take to do it?
I think we took about 6 days.
Okay, so did that give you time to do some of the side trails?
Yeah. My boys were more adventurous and got to climb up Mount Ossa, which is the tallest mountain in Tasmania.
Yes. It is. It's higher than Federation Peak.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. There's lots of people do the walk from all over the world, and it's managed so that you have to book months ahead because they only let about 30 people a day.
So it won't be too congested.
Yeah. Otherwise it starts to really impact on the environment.
Yes.
So it's really stunning, and it gets you away from people, no electricity, you've got to carry everything on your back. And it's beautiful. It's a good walk.
Did you get some photos?
A few. Yeah.
When I go on walks, it takes me twice as long as even a normal photographer because I shoot still and video.
Yeah.
So it's just my friends are always kilometers ahead of me because I've taken so long. So your educational background was in environmental politics, and where did you grow up?
Oh, so I grew up in Brisbane, Queensland, and when I finished school I went down to Sydney, and I studied at Sydney University.
Yes.
I did government.
Okay.
But I just chose every subject about the environment that I could. So I called it an environmental politics degree.
Yes.
I did honours in that. And that was really interesting. I was young and idealistic and wanted to save the world, and I wanted to figure out how to do it. But actually what happened is I got really depressed in the end. I was also involved with the Wilderness Society and would go down to the forests and forest blockades. I was involved with Paddlers for Peace. So I used to kayak in Sydney Harbour in front of nuclear warships and rainforest timber ships and things like that. For real, yeah. That was a bit of fun, a bit silly. If I look back at some of the things we did. In a leaking kayak going across Circular Quay. The ferry drivers weren't impressed with me.
And so were you always kind of a nature-loving outdoor person, and you'd go up into the mountains or out to things like that?
Always nature-loving, always
but
idealistic.
You weren't just the city slicker.
No, I was the city slicker.
Were you?
Yeah,
How funny.
I wasn't so much. I grew up in the city, but
nature
not
wasn't.
like my sister. My sister went down and she rafted the Frank. She did her PhD on the Huon Pine.
So how did you fall in love with Tasmania or come to live here?
Oh, well, Tasmania. So when I was involved with the Wilderness Society, the campaigns were all about the Tasmanian wilderness. It wasn't long after the Franklin blockade.
And when exactly was that?
So the Franklin blockade was, it finished when Bob Hawke got into power in 1983.
Okay.
And he saved the Franklin by declaring it World Heritage.
Yes.
And so it was. But I was studying at uni in the late 80s, and in about 89, 90 was when I started to get more active with the environment movement. And finished my honours degree, which was a case study of the Southeast Forests campaign in New South Wales in 1990. And I was studying things like world order and the environmental challenge and superpowers in conflict. And it was a bit overwhelming. It was, I call it the greenhouse blues. It was depressing. It was like I just couldn't figure out how this was going to work. How are we going to save this? The more I studied in international relations, it was just like, this isn't going to work. They're not going to get this together. So it was really depressing, and that was really disempowering. When you're in despair, it's not a place where you're effective, and it's not a place where you're even active particularly.
Well, despair kind of implies that you've just like given up hope.
I remember.
There's no way, you don't see any way out or any point in continuing,
and I remember, everything had an environmental issue. Even I remember going for a walk down by Sydney Harbour, and there was a picnic table there, and I thought, even the paint on the picnic table has probably had some sort of environmental consequence in creating that. And it's not a space from which you can actually make positive changes. Fortunately, I came across a book by a writer called Shapcott.
Yes, that's a very interesting connection that we have.
Yeah, and I never actually read the whole book.
The Turning Point.
It was called The Turning Point.
Yes.
It was just the first 3 chapters.
Yes.
That really helped me, because I just wanted the big picture. I wanted to know if I was going to do an action or be involved with a protest. I wanted to know, how is that going to affect change? How is that going to help? I needed the big picture, and so that book, The Turning Point by Shapcott, it really gave me the sense of the big picture that I was looking for. And what he was basically saying, he was using the philosophy of yin and yang, which is a Chinese philosophy. And in that philosophy, what's good? So yang is a bunch of qualities, and we might sort of describe them as masculine qualities, outgoing qualities, assertiveness, sunshine, bright, hot, that sort of thing. And yin is a bunch of qualities, and it might be more feminine, it might be more intuitive, receptive, moon. So he listed a kind of qualities to get us to understand the idea. And in the Chinese philosophy of the I Ching, they said what's good is the balance between the yang and the yin, the balance between these lots of qualities. And what's bad is imbalance. Whereas in the Western culture, you have at one end of the extreme is really, really bad, and at the other end of the extreme is really, really good, and never the two shall meet. So it's a different way of thinking. It's not that yang is better than yin or yin that is better than yang. It's about having the balance between the two, which creates harmony. And then he went on to describe that the problem in our culture, the problem in our world at the moment, is that we're way out of balance. That we favour the yang qualities and we give them prominence and extra power or significance or wages, whatever, we
marginalize the feminine or the yin.
For example, we could, with our technology and our rational brain, we could soft land a spacecraft on the moon, but we couldn't stop the pollution coming out of the chimneys of the factory. So we've got this technological mind that we can put all our resources and make this amazing thing happen. But on the other hand, we're not putting the resources into just making sure we're not spilling pollution out of our chimneys. So
yes. Well, doesn't it is kind of a logical extension of the whole yang out of balance? Is that being yang, it would seek to dominate and control more and more and more. And so I think that tendency has been going on so long throughout what we call civilization.
So what he actually said is that if you look at a long view of history,
yes,
it goes like a pendulum.
There's cycles.
There's cycles, and it works like a pendulum. So you have periods where there's yang, and then it comes down to a period of change and balance, and then the periods where it's yin, and then it comes down to change and balance. And you can look through, and he does in his book, look through these cycles and see in our history where these things have happened.
Yes.
And his book's called The Turning Point, because what he's saying, we're at the peak of the yang cycle. And it's an optimistic book because it's saying, we're about to shift, we're about to change and get more towards the balance. And he says it's at this point, the turning point, where the powers that be, the ones who have benefited and favoured from the extreme yang, all the corporations and industry and the military industrial system, all that, on some level they can feel their power
ebbing away.
And so they hang on tighter.
Yes, and entrench themselves and
yeah.
Precisely. Well, that's exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah, and so it can look really bad. It can look like this is a disaster, it's getting worse. But if we perceive it differently, that they're hanging on tighter because they know that underneath they're actually losing their power, that things are changing, then it makes us more optimistic and it gives us hope. Yes, something's changing, there's hope. And after my experience of the depression, after, worrying about the state of the world, when I was so immersed in that, what I realised was the most important was hope. If you have hope, if you can be optimistic, then it makes us more constructive in our thinking, makes us more likely to try and do something which is going to solve the problem.
Yes.
So what I found for myself, after doing all that, I kind of got the picture about some of the things that were going on in the world, which were depressing and alarming. And I realised that if I was going to immerse myself in the issues, I'd just get depressed. So what I realised from reading Shapcott, that through our education system, it teaches us to very yang ways of thinking. But what was needed was more balance, was more bringing in some of the yin qualities, and that I needed to explore and experiment with that way of thinking. So it's a completely different, it's not like we can go out and fix the world, but we can cultivate the qualities that will help to bring it into balance. It's quite a different way of thinking. So effectively that's what I spent the next 30 years doing, is not so much sort of getting engaged with the activist side of things. I went and I lived in an organic farm in Tasmania. That's really what brought me to Tasmania. I had the opportunity to live on a beautiful property not far from here that's organic and biodynamic and being built up, beautiful stone cottage being built up from the earth, really, and learning about connecting with nature. I realised that I hadn't been familiar with the earth that we lived on. I didn't know what a zucchini plant looked like, Even realising, because we had just one solar panel and my room was in a little cabin separate from the main house, I had to go outside every night to go to bed, and I'd look at the moon and I'd really witness and observe the phases of the moon, and I'd never done that before. And I realised that each night the light would get brighter because the moon would get bigger and bigger and bigger, but then there would come a point, the moon would be rising an hour later each night. And so the next night after the full moon, it would start off really dark because the moon hadn't risen yet. So it's just beautiful to actually observe nature and get back in touch with nature after having grown up in the city. And so that was really, really precious, just to get back to the basics in that sense.
Yes.
And I was lucky enough to get a job working for the Greens on their magazine. So I worked for an organisation I believed in, but I didn't have to worry about the issues. I was just sort of doing administrative or laying out the magazine and that sort of stuff, and other people could worry about the issues. So, and then what happened? Well, from then I started having children. So
that was, you just anticipated my next question. I was going to say, like, at what point did you become a mom during this process, and how did that affect? And you mentioned one of your favorite books. It's called Parenting for a Peaceful World.
Yeah.
Who's the author?
A man called Robin Grill wrote a book called Parenting for the Peaceful World. So when I became pregnant and became a mum, it was like my whole intuition said, well, this is what I'm going to do now. You know, I'm not going to try and save the world, or I'm just focusing on this, and that this is actually the most important thing that we can be doing, because it's in the first few years of life that this little being's brain is forming, and there's all sorts of research on how the brain is developed. And in that book, Parenting for a Peaceful World, he goes on to say that, you know, those first few years, it's the physical attachment, it's the gazing in the eyes, and it connects the brain, the neurons which develop empathy. Yeah? So if you have a baby that doesn't have that, and there's been some studies that happened after the Second World War when there were lots of orphans and things like that, and it's that physical contact that's really essential for creating that emotional intelligence, the basicness of empathy. So when you think about all these babies that end up in childcare centres with one adult to 5 babies, they're not getting what they need in terms of physical touch and eye contact to really develop the strong empathy connections.
Yes.
That's needed. So this is important. So I just felt that this is what was important. And at the time my husband was building the house. He built a separate room from the main house, and he was spending a lot of time in the foundations, you know. I remember him doing his calculations for how much concrete he'd need to put in the foundations. There was a lot of very specific care and attention to it. And you never see it because it's under the ground.
Yes. So this is like the early years of someone's life.
Yeah. So for me, it was like all that time I was spending with my children when they were young and babies, that was building the foundations. Because if they're a little bit out, if the foundations of a house are a little bit out, the whole house is going to be out. Whereas if you get those foundations strong, everything else falls into place. And I knew I had the most influence on my children when they really wanted me. When they were babies and toddlers, they just want to be with you, and they actually pay attention to what you're saying.
Yes.
So if I can put the time and energy in there, then now when they're teenagers, they've got that foundation, they trust life, they know their needs are going to be met, and they're going to make good decisions. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and to me, I just wanted to ask you about, you're talking about the importance of having, you know, how if you've got one person with like 5 kids and how that might be a bit impoverished. But think of the sort of the implications and the consequences of people who, and I think this is quite commonly done, people who plop their little kids down in front of a television for many, many, many hours a day without even, you know, so that the television is their
babysitter, electronic babysitter.
And I think that if we examined the socio-psychological implications of that throughout the whole spectrum of the mentality of modern people, that is a huge...
It's not an easy thing that we ask, because there's so many demands in our life these days, and children are demanding, and the emphasis and priority is on going out and earning an income and getting your career, and I think, you know, the women, I really feel for the women of this generation who've done their studies and they've got a career, and then they're taking time off to have babies, and then they've only got a year and then they're back in the workforce, and that's really challenging. But I certainly, I don't want to be judgmental, and I think that one happy consequence that's coming out of that is that men are getting more involved.
Yes.
And that's fantastic. But yes, I think that we have to honour and value that this work is important.
Yes.
It is a job. It's not an easy job. It's a tough job.
It's probably the most important and demanding job that someone could have.
And,
if you're serious about doing it right.
So I like to think of, you know, sometimes it feels like you get left with the baby, you know, and that the rest of the world's going on out there and you're stuck. But I like to think that actually this is the creative centre of our culture. It is in these early years, you know, there's a saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world.
Oh, that's very interesting.
These are the moments we are creating the next generation. We're creating whether they're going to be empathetic. This book, the Parenting for a Peaceful World, Robin Grill says that people who have this attachment parenting or parenting where their empathy is really developed, they can't go out and kill people. They get to the battlefield, they can't do it, you know. And there's all sorts of stuff you hear, or you don't hear, in the army, how difficult it is to actually get people to kill their enemy. That it had to be that if they wouldn't shoot, then that soldier would get shot by their own officer. That's how tough it was. They had to do so much to get men to go and shoot because it was so against their nature.
Well, I think that's where mainstream religion has been of great assistance in that process.
In what way?
In getting people to kill others in way to do stuff they wouldn't normally do, by convincing them that you know they're the evil enemy. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. All sorts of techniques are used to.
Well, you know, this is just a little humorous aside, but I really felt like that this was symbolic of progress of humanity. When there was a movie that came out in the 80s, I think, called Junior, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger, you know, the big beefy guy.
Yeah.
And in this movie, he actually lactated.
So hang on.
It was. I didn't even see it, but he was nursing a baby.
Okay.
Through some kind of technological.
Right.
Thing. So I just got like, wow, you know, it's men's lip now. Men are lactating.
Yeah.
So, but it's just a joke, you know.
Yeah.
But it's pulling at the absurdity. But yes, I think very, very interesting. And so I always, you know, speaking of how we're molding the minds of the next generation, but through our choices of nurturing and generating an atmosphere of empathetic evolution and stuff like that. It's something I come across as an artist a lot is people say, Jeff, I wish I was an artist or that I could be an artist. And I go like, well, you know, in many ways you are already, regardless of whether you paint or write or play music or anything, you're still exercising your very sacred creative process to create who you are through your decision making and your choices, operating at every level all the time. And a lot of times people have received blocks because someone very important to them, an authority figure or even a parent, when they were very young, instilled in them that they were terrible at painting, or that they were terrible at math, or that they were terrible at music. And I think that if someone's creating anything at all, how can that process be bad or negative? And it's not about the artifact, it's about the process. And so I think that is a really unfortunate way that sort of the opposite of what you're talking about becomes involuntarily ingrained in people.
Absolutely, and we're all victims of victims. You know, we're all we are in a world that is wounded, and we're all wounded. And there's no way that any one of us could be the perfect parent and provide the perfect environment for a child. And we just have to learn that that's part of the deal, and that we have to be resilient. But we're all wounded, and I think that it's something that we don't consider, but. You know, my grandfathers both fought in the First World War, and that was pretty intense. And my father would wake up as a child to his father screaming like a baby in the middle of the night because he was reliving the terrors.
Yes,
you know, and that's going to affect him. And he's you know, that generation, they had to just sort of put it past them, not look back, and just get on with life. And that's what they did. But then the next generation, it's like, well, hang on, there's all this stuff that's obviously not right, and nobody's talking about it.
Well, and then back then, I don't think they had the category of post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
There's labels for all kinds of syndromes and stuff now, but that's a big thing. And I think, you know, a lot of it's exaggerated, but a lot of it is exactly what you're talking about. These memories of and experiences that people went through that were so horrific that they can't. It's exerted a permanent sort of a psychic or emotional scar.
And when you look at epigenetics, there's some interesting studies through a new field called epigenetics, and it looks at how physiologically we can carry on issues.
Absolutely.
That happen.
The concept of body armor and things like that. And interestingly, remember we watched that movie The Last Wave the other night. You were asking me about where Peter Weir got the ideas for that, and there was this Russian psychoanalyst named Emanuel Velikovsky, who I mentioned. And to me, this is just a really quick aside here, but he was a psychoanalyst who studied under Freud. He broke off and started doing his own thing, and one of his main contributions was hypothesizing, or to me realizing, that humanity as a whole, our whole species, has been traumatized repeatedly through cataclysmic planetary level events that we've lived through the whole time we've existed on Mother Earth, because of periodic, you know, planetary catastrophic things do happen and have happened, and we've lived through these times possibly even not knowing if we were going to make it. So all our ancestors we have this in our collective memory, and part of Velikovsky's hypothesis is that because these memories are so horrific, we've been collectively repressing them for many millennial generational time periods, and so it's exerting a destructive effect on our psyche, driving us to, for example, recreate our own destruction through a lot of what we're doing with, like, you know, the military-industrial complex and stuff. But you know, taking it down to the individual level, I think that the healing process starts with the individual, right?
And it comes back to healing. Heal yourself, heal the planet.
Yes.
So when we're looking at that model of the yang and the yin and the need for balance between these qualities, that healing is very much a yin quality. And I remember thinking when I was younger, people who are healthy psychologically and physically and emotionally, they don't go out and ruin the planet, you know? They don't go out and cut down trees and dig up mines, and there's, on some level, it's either ignorance or fear that drives these behaviours. And so it comes back down to healing. Heal yourself, heal the planet. As we heal, we are more likely to be in balance within ourselves, and we're more likely to have actions and behaviours which do less harm on the planet. So So that's a worthwhile thing to do, and that's one of the qualities that is important to do. So I like to validate people who are in healing modalities, and there's a whole movement now. You can see that there's a whole movement for people to heal themselves, and that's a valid part of this process. And I want to acknowledge and validate anyone who spends time with young children. Steve Biddulph's a wonderful writer who's written a number of books about young children. He says time spent with children is never time wasted. So when I was mothering, I thought, I'm doing this for my planet. It's parenting for a peaceful world. It's when we get these foundations right, this is the best thing I can be doing right in this moment for my planet, is creating this next generation. So I like to validate anybody who's spending time with young children as you're at the creative centre, and it's such an important job, and well done you.
Yes. Just a little footnote on working with children. I'm not like a teacher or anything like that, but something I am really lucky to be able to do now and then is to do rock painting with school kids. And then, like especially when I do it, they tend to be all the way from ones that are like 5 or 6 years old all the way up to like 17 or 18, and it's so special. So special. And I would never call myself a teacher. In fact, I don't really like that word. I like facilitator, better, or something like that. But it's so, to just give them the opportunity to just cut loose and have fun, and without there being any kind of expectation about what they're going to create, and least of all, whether it could be good or bad or right or wrong or anything like that, but just, to honor the creative process, and to create a situation where they are, and where they feel free to do just to make it fun. And that's why we call it play music, because if you want to get good at an instrument, if you feel like you're torturing yourself by forcing yourself to go and practice, it's much more fun and happy, and you go a lot further quicker if like playing and practicing is the same thing.
Yes.
And if you don't, if it stays.
I remember when I was giving my son, or I was paying for my son to have guitar lessons some years ago, my eldest son, and he went. Sometimes he would go for a while, and then he might have a gap for a year, and then come back up again. And I'm saying, it's just play. I'm happy to offer these lessons to give you this opportunity, but it's just play. I think play is of course it's a really important notion. It's how we learn. It's important not just for children, but for adults as well. And I think with children, Maria Montessori is a woman who is famous for her philosophy, and there's been Montessori schools around the world, and her basic principle, as I understand it, was that you create an environment which is learning rich.
Yes.
And then you let the child do their own thing.
Yes.
So children learn by example. Absolutely. So I homeschooled my kids for about 8 years, and I did some reading to see how to approach that. And basically what I read said, you don't try and mimic school. You can't mimic school. You haven't got all the resources. You provide a learning-rich example, and you be a good role model. So you have to walk the talk. You have to be the person that you want your children to be.
Exactly, because it doesn't matter what you say.
It's do what you do. It's
Absolutely.
not do what I say. It's do what you do. And that to me was the basic principle that I had. So I taught my children that education, it can be the wings to set you free, that the world really is wonderful, that it's an interesting, fascinating place, that learning is exciting and great. And they soaked it up, and that, we had instruments in the house, we had lots of Lego, we had lots of board games and pens and papers and books, and sure, I did sit down with them and made sure they could read and write. It wasn't completely free-range. But it is. We don't have to force kids to learn. We don't have to force them to do that. They will learn. It's in their nature to learn and to be creative. It's that they're hardwired to be creative, and they're hardwired to copy us. And it's that principle that we can take with us, and you don't have to make kids do things. You have to be the example.
Let them choose their own way.
Well, it's not that you don't guide them. You still they need boundaries. They absolutely need boundaries.
Yes.
They need guidance. They need to know where you stand, and they need you to be consistent.
But do you think that there comes a point when parents realize that their children are, in fact, autonomous beings, that with minds of their own, and that it's probably difficult to not have expectations in some levels about your kids?
There's that quote from Kahlil Gibran: "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and the daughters of life's longing for themselves. They come through you, but they are not from you. And though they are with you, they belong not to you. You can give them your love, but not your thoughts. They have their own thoughts. You can house their bodies, but not their souls. For their souls dwell in a place of tomorrow where you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. You can strive to be like them, but you cannot make them just like you."
Very beautiful.
Yeah. Kahlil Gibran.
That's really cool. Well, speaking of other people that came up with very interesting stuff, Gandhi coined a word, and we're trying to determine its correct pronunciation, but it's Satyagraha, Satyagraha.
That's how I pronounce it. I'm not sure.
And it means soul power?
Or truth force.
Truth force, yes, I like that. So now, and he had a very powerful paradigm of nonviolence, nonviolent resistance to even totalitarian regimes and things like that. And
so when I was being an activist in Sydney back in about 1990, I trained up to be a workshop facilitator for nonviolence workshops, and I took a number of workshops around the place, which was very good. That's Gandhi was really the one that brought this philosophy to the West, and he talks about truth force, or satyagraha, sat meaning light or truth. And so the notion is, when you stand in your truth, when you know deep inside that what you're standing for is true, that gives you tremendous power. And it gives you an inner authority that gives you strength. So that's why you'll see people who are defending their country. That's an advantage for them because they're defending what's true. Whereas an invading army, especially if they're hired thugs, they haven't got the same will or force.
Yes, but how about this though? I mean, this throws another level of complexity into that whole thing, because what about the relativity of what truth is? Because one group of people might believe a certain set of beliefs to be true, and the other people might believe a completely different set of beliefs to be true, and this kind of thing. And so to them, to each of them, they totally 100% believe in the reality and the veracity and the truth of their belief, even if it's completely at odds with somebody else.
That's why religious wars are so...
Well,
such an issue.
Do you remember a writer that did these famous children's books named Dr. Seuss?
Yes.
Did you know that his very last book, it's called the Butter Battle Book? And I'll just tell you, the basic hypothesis is that there's these two groups of beings, the Zooks and the Ukes, and they're absolutely identical in every single way.
Yeah.
The only difference between them is that they butter their bread on opposite sides.
Okay.
And so because of this difference, the book begins, they're already at odds with each other. They're going like, look, how dare you butter your bread on the wrong side?
Yeah.
So then it sort of escalates. It's clearly a parody of the whole thing of like human warfare and nuclear war. And so they're threatening, they're building their biggest weapon systems and threatening to launch them on each other. And the way it ends, it's not resolved. They've got their most giant weapon systems aimed at each other, ready to just unleash. And then Dr. Seuss goes like, well, what's going to happen? Well, we will see. That was his sort of like his final. But
good old Dr. Seuss.
But truth is a very interesting. To me, I get people go like, well, what is truth? And I go, well, ultimately, it's a 5-letter word in English.
The writer Clarissa, I think it was the writer Clarissa Estella Pincares, I think it was from her. She wrote a book called Women Who Run with the Wolves, which was
I've heard of that, yes.
I think it was her that I was listening to, said truth is what works.
Wow, that can be interpreted a number of different ways.
So I think that whilst we spend our time searching for ultimate truth,
well,
really, is that so important? Isn't what works more helpful?
Exactly. I've seen a psychological warfare textbook from the Army, and the title of it is "Truth is Our Weapon."
Wow.
But see, now think about that. Think about the implications of a mentality that embraces that kind of approach. And the different levels in it.
Yeah.
And then also, you touched on a very interesting thing, because a lot of kind of New Age people that I've run into, they express to me what is a completely incredulous attitude that I don't see how anybody could possibly believe. They'll say like, well, but look, it isn't, but really, isn't everything just perfect in the world, just exactly as it should be? And I go like, well, right. Ask the people in Palestine how perfect their life is. Yeah, I mean, and all the animals that were, and there's so much horrific pain and suffering and destruction that our species is doing. And so how anybody can think that that's meant to be and perfect. And so, but ultimately, from a philosophical perspective, you can only say that things are what they are. And, and I go like, well, and I go like, well, but we've chosen to do all these things. So, but ultimately, from a cosmic perspective, it's probable, like you've heard of the idea of the yugas, right? That these they're sort of like really long seasons of like a galactic cycle. And the Kali Yuga, is the one of darkness and the Iron Age. When a lot of people think that that's what we're in right now. And so it may be that we can't not pass through the yugas in terms of it's like trying to stop the seasons of the year or stop natural climate change that which is a big thing in the world of today. It's inevitable that the things that anything that's dynamic and alive is not static. Nothing, and so everything does change, and there's ebbs and flows. That's what the thing of I used to paint the I Ching hexagram for the turning point. And the symbol, because I thought that was such a powerful. I think it's hexagram number 24, and so. But the search for ultimate. But it's like what you said. What works at the pragmatic level is probably more important to strive for in the world that we live in, where gravity is real, and
there's so much thinking, there's so much insights and thinking and ways of perceiving the world that's available for us to become aware of, and that whole notion of what is definable of reality, and
Well, is there a difference between what you believe to be reality
and what is ultimate objective reality?
Because it's so complex. I mean, it's really, there's no firm, it just depends on the frame of reference you want to adopt. I mean, I use the metaphor of like, if someone was convinced that gravity didn't exist, but they can still fall down if they trip. Or it's like I've hung out with a lot of Buddhists last year, and they seem to be fixated on the idea that everything's an illusion.
Yeah.
I mean, but look, if somebody throws a brick at you, you're going to duck because the brick's not an illusion. You can't convince your body. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So, but that's trying to be in denial of that which works.
Well, it's a whole way of thinking. It's a whole.
We have to. Maybe I'm trying to bring together a couple of the main themes that we've talked about. Is there a way to sort of instill in young people a more profound sense of an expanded horizon of what
is?
Yes,
I found the movie "What the Bleep Do We Know" really, really fascinating. Are you familiar with that one?
Yes.
And looking at quantum physics, and when you look at an object, that's broken down into its parts, and then each part is broken down to atoms, and each atom's broken down to the electrons and neutrons, and really they're all just buzzing around, and mostly there's not much matter there. It's mostly energy. So when you look at that, this feels like a really solid chair that I'm sitting in, but actually it's mostly energy, and it's just the way that they're moving which gives it form.
Yes.
So in principle, there could be things that happen way outside our current level of understanding.
I would say the vast majority of everything in the universe would be in that category.
So we understand something, it feels really solid when we feel it, but we also, through quantum physics, understand it's just electrons and neutrons buzzing around and mostly energy. And we kind of had this conscious understanding that we, if we get hit by a brick, we'll feel it. And but we don't know how much of that, how much our mind and our awareness and our consciousness is part of that. So in that movie, the What the Bleep Do We Know, they were starting to explore the effect of our consciousness, just observing this interaction that they were doing with their experiment, just by whether they were observing it or not, affected the results of the experiment.
Absolutely. It's the Fritjof Capra. Is who I first learned about that from. That was my first exposure to the quantum relativistic paradigm. And this actually ties in with something that we were talking about yesterday. Remember I told you about the artist that we saw speak in Western Australia, and we were talking about, he said that every Aboriginal language and culture that's ever existed had a completely unique worldview and cosmology that was equally as true and valid and rich and beautiful as anything in the Bible, which is really ultimately just the story of one tiny little group of people, but it's become such a dominant thing in the world. But so every time, every Aboriginal culture, every indigenous language that we lose is a whole big piece of the puzzle gone. And you were talking about the importance of language on our whole perception of reality, and different languages predispose people to different perceptions of reality. And so much of it, we're completely impoverished in the breadth and depth of our worldview by not being able to speak other languages that might even, we were talking about how even the reasons that they would speak might be very different from how we do, and to be able to, if you grew up in a different culture, you might actually see things that might actually be invisible to people in our society, and so this is something in my work with the whales and dolphins, and you sort of see a continuum where humanity is not separate. We're actually connected with all our other fellow mammals, the whole animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and they all have sensation and perception and spirits and senses of being. And I think that this is another thing that I think is important to instill in young people is to me, I'll use the word sacredness, the sacredness of all life. Anyone that's alive is part of our family. And we're supposed to be their guardians and caretakers. And I think that's where the yang out of balance has happened, is rather than applying the yang principle to being a guardian, the yang has become destructive,
controlling and dominating.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a whole different perception. It's a whole different way of perceiving the world. And I guess in some ways, if you're in a culture which is yin or introspective or intuitive, perhaps your yang qualities aren't very well developed.
Yes.
So perhaps you're not outspoken. So when you have a culture that has got really developed yang qualities, that's very forceful, that's very outspoken, and it meets a culture that's got really developed yin qualities, that's very receptive and intuitive, well, the yang one doesn't perceive any of the richness that the yin culture has, and so it just takes over.
Exactly. Australia is a perfect example of that.
So, but it may be that the yin culture needs to develop enough of the yang qualities so that it can start to be assertive and communicate and stand its ground.
Well, does this mean that marsupials need to arm themselves with bazookas to blow up oncoming vehicles before they get run over? I'm just kidding.
Well, we speak for those who can't speak for themselves. But we find, I think one of the things in our culture, in our society, we've had this massive imbalance between men and women.
Well, and may I ask you, I brought it up kind of, my friend Claudia von Werloff, who is a very interesting woman who I really think that you would enjoy learning about her work. And she's an academic, retired person in Austria that is doing extensive writing about the dominance of the patriarchal paradigm. And when I was asking you, kind of contrast the matriarchal systems relative to the yin and yang thing, and it's quite complex, but
we've been very out of balance.
Yes.
And it's been men and women have been out of balance, as well as the masculine or the yang and the feminine or the yin. Pardon me. And I think that that's changing when I look at my mother's life, from her having to quit her job as a teacher when she got married, to how much that's changed now. And women have had to develop their masculine qualities, their yangness, to make their way into the workforce. In the 80s when I was a teenager, you could see that it was being promoted. They had to be power dressing. They had to learn to talk like a man and walk like a man and think like a man.
Smoke a cigarette.
So that men would start to listen to them. This is why Maggie Thatcher was the first PM, because she had these sort of masculine qualities, and she certainly didn't do anything for women's rights in England. But it's, in a sense, that's been the spearhead. And once women have, once the first tough blokey women start to find their way through, then it's easier for other women to start to get positions in organisations, and then you find that they start to think differently and handle issues differently and problem solve differently, and that's changing the way we think. That's changing. It's tipping the balance, and at the other end of the extreme, you now get, or the other thing that happens as a consequence, and I can see it in this generation, is the men are paying more attention to the kids. They're more hands-on with looking after their babies, and you see it if you watch the comedy shows on the ABC. Just about everyone, there's some section in there where they're joking about toddlers and babies and being spewed on and kept up at night. And
well, maybe
you never got that when I was growing up. And the other thing that's happening is, which is exciting is that men are feeling that they are more able to express their femininity.
Yes, well, we could go a long way by talking about stuff like that, with all the sort of like the kind of the transgender paradigm, you know, and maybe with the help of Monsanto, maybe men can actually lactate like Arnold Schwarzenegger said. No, I'm just kidding, but you know, but yes,
you know, when you go to Thailand, you find that actually in these other cultures, you know, they have what's called ladyboys, and it's quite accepted that some men will be more feminine.
Yes,
and we hear now about these transgender boys who want to be women and what have you, and I feel like, and somebody pointed out that actually they're not really like women, they still behave like men in a number of ways. And what I feel is like, why don't they broaden the concept of what it is to be a male? You know, for 100 years or more, women have been able to wear pants, and,
yes,
and women have been able to express their masculinity or be the tomboy or what have you. And now we understand that to be a female, we don't all have to be ultra feminine.
yes,
and now that's happening for men, and so they're allowing there's permission happening now for men to accept and embrace more feminine qualities.
Well,
and
yes,
that's fantastic. That's wonderful.
To me, it's important to emphasize that we're all people.
Yeah.
And the same with the kind of artificial distinction that's becoming increasingly blurred between like indigenous people and people that aren't indigenous, or like, you know, white, the quote unquote white man, which I've never actually seen someone who was white, and it's like, you know, because they and you call me colored, you know, like in that poem, but it's like you know, so I'm always talking about, you know, a lot of this stuff, male, female, masculine, feminine, indigenous, whatever. It's emphasizing the differences between people that aren't really real, rather than the inclusivity of that we're all people.
Yeah, and I think my son was asking me, you know, why don't they see that there's more? It's not so much men and women so separate and different. And I'm thinking, yeah, absolutely. And the more we allow that, the more we can see it's just people, and that there's more similarities between people than there are differences, whether they're male or female, and we allow for that. Well, but we have come out of a culture where the differences have been very pronounced, and our society has held them up rigidly, and that's not been good for women, and it's not been good for men.
Yes.
And this is a change. This is a change, and it's an exciting change, and I think it's going to have huge repercussions that we're not even aware of yet.
Yes. So, in our last few minutes here, I can't tell you how wonderful this is to talk with you. I think you're a very beautiful spirit, and you've been having kind of a gestation period, and I think you're getting ready to blossom forth with a lot of beautiful gifts for your local community in Tasmania, which I consider to be probably the most special and the best place to be living on this whole planet right now. So, but what do you see on your horizon for the immediate and near future in terms of projects? You're doing some writing. You've actually got a little book in hardcover. You're a step ahead of me with that.
Okay, so I'm going to answer that by saying I'm embracing the 3 phases of women's life. Maiden, mother, crone. And we can have it all, we can do it all, just not all at once. So I totally embraced my journey as motherhood. I homeschooled and that was wonderful. And now my children are just at the verge. They're not quite left the home yet, but they're getting close. So I'm looking to the next phase of my life where I'm hoping to express and communicate and share more of the ideas that come to me when I sit on the couch and do my meditations, and sometimes I write them all down. And I feel that the 3rd phase of women's life is a really empowered phase of life, and it's a time to give back and share something that we've learned to our communities and to our people. And I feel that in our culture, the mature woman has being made invisible.
But marginalized. You were using the analogy of the crone being associated with winter.
listening to UCY.tv. Why don't you stick around for more awesome radio?